I have to begin, I think, with the sadly defunct concept of the fool. Whoever tells you today that the fool is an actual type of person? Fools despise wisdom. The world has no interest in wisdom. You might say, wisdom is kind of a high calling. Whose business is a thing like that? You are saying no normal person has a calling to this. You are rejecting wisdom too. There are 1,000 ways to do it. Wisdom is not a hard concept to grasp. What is hard is to be wise. But to get wisdom, that is not so hard. Wisdom is the highest learning and the deepest understanding, the big picture, if by that you mean the most comprehensive grasp of all the most essential things. You are one of the essential things to you. Now, who needs this? If you do not think that you do, then you are a part of the world rejecting wisdom. This is a sign of serious confusion. You have an idea of what is important, and it does not include getting insight. Wisdom is the highest learning. I suppose you have heard of higher education. College is what is today called higher education, but the meaning here is something built on top of lower education. High school is high because built on top of elementary school. And of course, you can go higher, built on top of high school. But does higher in higher learning ever mean more than built on top of? Does it ever mean higher in the sense of more important, vital? Whatever you get this. Call something higher, meaning more important today, and someone is going to say, says who? This might be a reasonable retort in a culture that accepts no understanding of the world, save that, to treat you fairly, we have to let you decide what is important. Nothing is officially important but that. But let's just cut to the chase here. Where exactly are we? We are in the valley of the shadow of death. And to this, the retort, says who, is just laughable. There is higher learning, and it is the knowledge of how to live in the valley of the shadow of death. This is a dangerous place. In the book of Proverbs, wisdom offers her help. We need a map to get out of here alive. Now, I appreciate that you might think you know. You have this knowledge. Or everything essential you will just pick up for yourself as time goes by. This is another way of rejecting wisdom. Christians in our fallenness reject wisdom too. The impulse is in us. But you might argue that because we have Christ, we do not need knowledge of how to live in this world. He replaces this. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. The knowledge that Christ has died for you, that Christ is with you, is all the knowledge that is needed. If Christ is with you, there is no need to fear. What map of the world do we need when Christ is our shepherd? Christ is wisdom. Isn't this all very clear? But a Christian like Augustine, the namesake of this college and an excellent reader of Scripture, would have said that to truly have Christ with you in this valley and escape the threat, evade the confusion those shadows create, you must use your mind. You must accept Christ into your mind as wisdom and not use him to leave your mind as it is, untouched by this cross. You must crucify your thoughts. It is Christ who calls us to crucify the mind of all worldliness by rejecting, renouncing, and removing from the mind all worldly thoughts, ideas, philosophies, perspectives, values, and beliefs that are contrary to the Father's way, the Father to whom Christ was obedient. We must take on the mind of Christ. Here's an idea of higher learning. In the medieval tradition that spawned the college, you have the idea shown here of the seat of wisdom, the sedis sapientiae. Two figures, one a human being, Mary, and the other God incarnate, Christ, seated in Mary's lap. Mary here is the seat of wisdom, and Christ is wisdom. And you see that Christ is contained within Mary. Christ's figure fits within Mary's outline. Having Christ within you is a key idea in the New Testament, where it is presented as the very manner of our life, our safe passage through the valley. We are each to be the human seat of wisdom. Christ's understanding is supposed to inhabit us. That is to say, we are to learn to think as Jesus thought. The world is the way it is because this is not happening. The world rejects wisdom. But how can a follower of Christ show indifference to wisdom? And here at the Cathedral of Chartres outside Paris was one of the cathedral schools at which higher learning was taught, a task of bishops at cathedrals. The seat of wisdom is shown above the door here at one of the schools that was to generate the university, where the college would arise. My objective today is to tell you what Augustine College is. Here is the Cathedral School of Chartres, and here is Augustine College. 900 years later, a direct offspring of that kind of school, a straight line from Chartres to the comparatively drab room you are sitting in now. Had I begun by saying that Augustine College is a direct descendant of the medieval cathedral school, you would have said, who cares? But you can't say who cares if you understand what I have said. Every age needs, more than anything else, the understanding of how to think in this valley of the shadow of death. Without it, you become part of the problem. You are a part of the darkness. In Augustine's time, further back on this timeline, were the schools at which this knowledge was developed. In the 13th century were the cathedral schools that taught it. Today, in the 21st century in Ottawa, you can study it here at this college. The need has never diminished. I hope you can see that. If someone were offering today a program in wisdom, doing all they could at least to measure up to that, the reason you would not go would have to be that you reject wisdom. It couldn't be that it cost too much. So what I would like to do is to try to explain exactly what we are doing at this college. What I have said may make some sense, but it prompts questions. What you may have heard about the college won't, I think, answer them. Maybe you've heard that Augustine College is a Christian college or a liberal arts college. But what do those things mean? And it so happens that to tell you what this college is takes some explaining. In fact, I can't even use the word college without throwing you off the track. I need the hour we have actually to teach something that I don't think you've been told about Western history. And you will see why advertising this college is so impossible. If I could say 5 things to explain what Augustine College is, I would probably state 5 facts. Augustine College has brought back the original Christian college model that was actually once dominant in North America. That model of college was generated by a biblical concern, renewal of the mind, that is, reversing the fallenness of our minds, which deeply threatens us. The Christian college on this original model, pursuing the distinct purpose of Christian formation, offered a specialized kind of instruction, liberal arts studies focused on man's true purpose, the concern of wisdom. This model of Christian college was driven out of society by Enlightenment thought to be replaced by universities. Not teaching in the way Christians once taught has caused the Christian understanding of things to wither in society, hastening the normalization of all kinds of views contrary to the Christian understanding of life. Meaning that Christians have these contrary views themselves. For instance, the view that people are not deeply confused about life, do not need pruning, or that you know best what you should study. Nobody else can tell you what kind of higher education you should have, etc. But these 5 points, without the story they belong to, won't mean much to you. I'm going to have to put some flesh on these bones, primarily to meet your objections, because there's a lot here that you might doubt. You might say, Christian colleges were not driven out of society, as the facts prove. Or you might say, I believe in renewal of the mind, but study doesn't do this. You don't need a college to be a Christian. If this is the job of any institution, it is the job of the churches, and they're still here doing that job. Or you might say, I'm not lost in the wilderness. I am found by Christ. Christian students are not deeply confused about life. They are the students who are not. I have to meet these challenges. Augustine College has brought back the original Christian college model developed at medieval schools and universities. What model is this? The term university is the medieval name of a kind of institution invented by Christians in the Middle Ages for Christian ends. Medieval universities were made up of colleges. The earliest colleges were schools brought into existence by some rich benefactor like Walter de Merton, a bishop who was Chancellor of England and gave his money to create Merton College at Oxford in 1264, or John de Balliol, whose widow gave money for the founding of Balliol College in 1282. These benefactors cared about higher education, but they did not theorize about education or come up with a new understanding of learning. They funded scholars whose studies perpetuated an older tradition of learning. So in medieval Cambridge or Paris, there's a certain amount of money to buy a property, hire a few masters to teach, a chaplain to conduct church services in the chapel, since the college was a religious organization. The students enrolled at the college lived there and followed the program of the college in which they had enrolled. There were no electives. And they were shaped by that college program. At Balliol, they were required to speak Latin in their daily lives and would be kicked out if they didn't. Different colleges might teach different subjects to some extent, according to which masters were at the college, but all these schools taught what they taught under the roof, so to speak, of theology. Here is a Renaissance picture showing Thomas Aquinas, who taught at the University of Paris, surrounded by learned men, but in the closer company of figures representing philosophy, theology, dialectic, and grammar. But one of the four is clearly predominant. She sits at Thomas's right hand. He inclines his head to her as she turns to him. Who is she? Theology, then known as the Queen of the Sciences. Aquinas wrote, "Other sciences are called the handmaidens of theology." All of the studies taught in the colleges are sciences, which simply means activities oriented to scientia, the Latin word for knowledge, and theology, attentive to God, is the queen of these sciences. At the center you see Aquinas in the habit of his religious order, holding in his left hand a book with the words Sapientiam sapientum perdam. This is biblical, words from the Apostle Paul. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. Thomas's right foot rests on a laughing man. He is a fool, in whose hand is a banderole with the inscription, Sapientia vincit malitiam, wisdom conquers evil. These two ideas of wisdom, that there is a wisdom of the wise that will be destroyed, and another wisdom that conquers evil, are key concepts in the outlook of the college model that I am describing. Hear me talk of the original college model, and you might perhaps get the idea that someone sat down to design the perfect education for Christian youth. But this was not an education designed for Christian youth. Education is still a privilege opened to only a few. These colleges were largely formed to produce priests. So at Balliol, we are told all the students studied what was called divinity. But here's the point I am making. The list of subjects drawn up to educate the clergy were the same subjects later taught in colleges when education became available to the masses, so to speak. We're looking at a model of higher education whose essentials were laid down for the training of the clergy. If you think today about the training of a priest or a minister, you're likely to imagine that this job, that is the usual way to frame this today, involves specialized and fairly narrow learning. Learning the Bible, learning how to conduct services, learning canon law. But if this is your idea, you're quite out of step with the Christian past. The Christians who developed things like colleges had a far broader idea of what this so-called job involved. Think about the task of a priest or a minister. You were to become a shepherd of souls, says John Chrysostom. You are to guide your flock in their lives. And Chrysostom says that a thinking person will run from this task. In a book he wrote on being a priest, he says, suppose someone brought a merchant ship loaded with valuable freight and sat me at the rudder and told me to cross the Aegean. I would jump off at the first opportunity. And if anybody asked me why, I should say, to save sinking the ship. And then he writes, but where the fate of the shipwrecked is to fall not into the sea, but into an eternal state of misery. Do you understand my reluctance, he asks, to accept this role? I know how weak and puny my own soul is, he writes. I know the importance of that ministry and the great difficulty of it. Therefore, the man who accepts this responsibility, Chrysostom says, needs great wisdom and the grace of God in good measure and an upright character and a pure life. And such people do not walk in off the street. A person like this needs to be formed. What is this great wisdom he mentions? What should you learn? You should know as much as you possibly can about all the essentials. You should get off the path of thinking you know and learn what life is for. You should see what exactly is wrong with the lures of the world, the illusions about reality that will lead you astray, take you off the path to the kingdom. You should know how to answer the questions your parishioners will put to you about the meaning of life, about suffering, death, and despair, about justice, evil, about God's distance, about God's very existence. You should know how to answer questions about right and wrong from people in your congregation who want to do what is right. And the studies that covered all these matters were essentially 4 in number. The study of questions to do with God, the study of ethics, human life, right and wrong, the study of how to think in reaching conclusions and disposing of errors, what the medievals called the chief branch among the liberal arts, without which no one can teach or be taught properly, but also how to speak, since truth emerges in debate. And in Western Europe, the study of Latin, so that you could read the books in which these things were treated. This gives us the basic subjects taught in medieval colleges. Now, if you look at this and ask, but where's the course on the Bible? You're making what turns out to be a modern assumption. What you're looking at here are areas of study, and the Bible is not an area of study. It is a source and foundation of all study. If you were to ask a medieval teacher, where was the knowledge in all these subject areas to be found? He would have answered, in the book of Scriptures and the book of the world. To study theology, you must indeed study the Bible. Likewise, when you study ethics, the proper way to live. So the Bible is not left out. If a medieval teacher came to life today and listened to what you told him philosophy is, as perhaps you have been told, a way of thinking not involved with religion, he would say, where did you get this distorted conception? What else is philosophy if not the love of the divine? Philosophy, philosophia, the love of wisdom, and it is God who is wisdom. This is John of Salisbury, who was present at the death of Thomas Becket and was later Bishop of Chartres. There is no division between philosophy and Scripture. In the college, the wisdom in Scripture is a perfect handrail and basis for the development of philosophy. The Bible is not excluded from any of these studies. There is Scripture on every page of Aquinas' Summa Theologia, which we study at Augustine College in our philosophy course. This list of subjects, then, is the heart of the medieval curriculum. And notice what is missing. There's no science, literature, or history. Greek philosophy began as science, but, says John of Salisbury, it was given a better direction by Socrates. John wrote, though before his time philosophers devoted their attention to the phenomena of nature, Socrates is said to have been the first to turn the attention of philosophy to the correction and improvement of morals. This was indeed a wise course, since everything should be turned to one's advantage, and since it profits little to be acquainted with the works of God, unless one make it his chief aim not to be evil himself. Study botany, fine, says John, but only when you have given your first attention to the weed that you are. Note that the profit he mentions is not economic or material, service of the body, it is profit of the soul. This progress was what a college education was for. The usual perception today of medieval study sees it as completely impractical, involved with all sorts of extraneous concerns, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, and so on. Well, that's not at all what we find. John of Salisbury writes that even logic deserves only the minimum attention, since even the chief branch among the liberal arts, without which no one can teach or be taught properly, is to be merely skimmed. Who can imagine that time should be devoted to other branches, which do not conduce to the betterment of man? For even those things that are required for man's use prove very harmful if they occupy his attention to the exclusion of all others. So register that last remark about the harm done to your soul when interesting studies that occupy your attention keep you from the study that matters. What the college was for was to learn how to travel through this valley shrouded in thick darkness, to see where the paths were, to do the mind's part in getting the light of Christ into us. What is just and righteous? Dealing with my fellow man. We need to acknowledge our confusion, admit our ignorance, admit how weak and puny our own souls are. Very little reflection is going into where we step in each of our acts. And it had long been understood that your life, no less than your body, may suffer disease. Note that to a person who asks, of what use is Democritus or Socrates to a Christian? The medieval answer would have been, the person who in his life is ailing and ill has often left the path of life because of what he thinks, imagining that there on that hill is life. All this person needs is the truth, just the truth. Augustine told us, let every good and true Christian understand that where truth may be found, it belongs to his master. So the idea of education is the cultivation of oneself by taking advantage of all the wisdom that was available, whatever was committed to writing as worthy of being remembered, as Augustine put it, so that you would live, and living be an aid to others in living. This is formation, intellectual, moral, and spiritual. Cultivation in the medieval sense, being watered and pruned, so as to be Christ-like. This is not just a necessity for a priest like Chrysostom, Augustine, John of Salisbury. It is the understanding needed for life. John of Salisbury writes, if every man were to labor in the cultivation of himself and were to regard things external to himself as no proper concern of his, straightway the condition of each and all would become the best possible. Virtue would flourish and reason prevail so that we could serve God with full devotion. What I have, in fact, been describing then is the plan of study, the curriculum, and the purpose of what became known as the Liberal Arts College. It was set down in the medieval university, and then in the Renaissance was slightly expanded with the addition of Greek, the language of the New Testament, and of newly revived Greek literature. St. Basil in the 4th century had considered Homer's Odyssey to be a kind of catalog of virtues worthy of our attention. Poetry and history join a curriculum that Renaissance scholars are now calling Studia Humanitatis, a term borrowed from Cicero, studies of man, from which we get the term humanities. But these humanities are not about man. They were to form man, to complete the formation that God had begun. By this time, we have entered the age of expansion, the establishment of new colonies, Dutch, English, French. One of the first acts passed when new colonies had got organized was often an act of education, calling for the creation of a school. And what kind of school? A college, not a university. In 1671, an act was passed in Annapolis, Maryland, for, quote, founding and erecting a school or college for the education of youth in learning and virtue. This is the Liberal Arts College, a school with the same curriculum and purpose that we have just surveyed. A charter of 1764 proclaims, institutions for liberal education are highly beneficial to society. Notice that. Is the idea that you become sophisticated at a liberal arts college? No, that you benefit society. How? I continue the quotation. By forming the rising generation to virtue, knowledge, and useful literature, and thus preserving in the community a succession of men duly qualified for discharging the offices of life. The 21st century mind wants to hear this as job training, but that is not at all what you heard. You do not get job training at any of these colleges. They aimed to produce, we have used the word form, people. That is, people of a certain kind, not experts with knowledge of either a job or a subject area, but people, quote, qualified for discharging the offices of life. That means people with the knowledge of how to live, how to function in society. It is a sign of real decline in understanding if we now think the offices of life are jobs. Life is being a good whatever you are, and you are a human being. If you think you are not a broken human being, that when you are played by life we hear beautiful music, then you must have the idea that you already have the mind of Christ, that you already know how to live, or that the noise coming from you that is not music at all is fine, because God forgives you. But when these colleges were created, the understanding was plain, that you are a human being who will hold many offices of life. And when you are poured into one and play the role of banker, citizen, friend, mother, daughter, farmer, teacher, if you know what you are doing, if you know what act is just, temperate, friendly, patient, kind, then we would have life and health in our community in you. Not death and disease in that bit of society. That is you. James Schall has said, students come to college wondering what they will be when they mean what they will do. They already are what they will be, and that is human beings. What's that, a human being? Ask Socrates, Basil, Augustine, Pascal. And how do you make a good one? You cannot make a good guitar not knowing what a guitar is for. And what do you know about being a person? Schall continues, if they do not know what they are, what they do will definitely be a problem for them. The idea of being qualified for discharging the offices of life is that in all your roles, you would act as a brother or a sister to everyone else. By 1671 or 1789 or 1848, college is not for priests, but for men and women who are indeed to play the role in every office of life of the shepherd of souls. Because everyone in society is visible to others and is leading others by their example. Do we need colleges for leadership? This is too close to business. The company needs a manager. But we don't need to be managed. We need to be. Our tradition was focused on forming good people who will be what God created them to be, have the life that is ours. Institutions for liberal education are highly beneficial to society. By forming the rising generation to virtue, knowledge, and useful literature, and thus preserving in the community a succession of men duly qualified for discharging the offices of life. You see that this is a college in the same tradition. Not a new kind of school that simply borrowed the name college, but a college of the same kind as the medieval college. To be qualified for discharging the offices of life is to be, yourself, a little oasis in the desert of the world. The main idea of the North American college is not jobs or society, but life. And in the colonial era, there was no other kind of school. No university, no rival form of college. Someone who knows a little about the history I am presenting might say to me that these colleges you are talking about were high schools. Not entirely wrong to say that, but you cannot appeal to a category from our day to clarify what used to be. These colleges indeed included what I have called lower education. It was these schools that did virtually all the teaching. They provided the equivalent of what we would call high school education. It was here that you learned grade 10 geography, grade 12 math, and it was the college that also offered lower education, even including elementary schools. That is why the buildings we are looking at were so large. And it is quite true that to the extent that the 18th or 19th century college offers lower education, that part of the college is not a continuation of the medieval college. But it is the other part that we are talking about. The higher studies are taught. The classical curriculum whose heritage we've been tracing is what the lower studies are the basis for, and the colleges delivered it. To call these colleges high schools, as if what they have in common with high school as we know it, the grade 12 math, tells us what they really are, makes little sense when the differences are so significant. What was essential to the college is that classical medieval heritage, the formative liberal arts course that included logic, rhetoric, philosophy, theology, morals, political history. If these things are offered at all in a high school today, they are options. We also cannot say it is a high school that teaches students between the ages of 14 and 17. Why? Why not go to college at 16 if you are prepared for it? Alexander Hamilton did that, enrolling at King's College, which you see here, at age 16, leaving 2 years later, before graduating. Was this 2 years of high school? The classical schooling Hamilton received at King's equipped him to contribute to the Federalist Papers, deeply illuminating remarks, pushing modern views aside, that first principles are not brought into being by the Constitution then being drafted. These principles had already to be in place as guidance in drawing up a Constitution, according to the laws of nature and reason. These were lights marking our path through the valley. Another author of the Federalist Papers, James Madison, entered the College of New Jersey at 18, studying philosophy, rhetoric, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and political philosophy. Madison wrote regarding the proposal for a general system of education in Kentucky that the American people owe it to themselves to prove that they are as favorable to the intellectual and moral improvement of man. That is, this Kentucky education is going to be a moral education, as they are to his individual and social rights. What spectacle can be more edifying than that of liberty and learning, each leaning on the other for their mutual and surest support? Madison is saying that you aren't set up to protect individual rights without a certain kind of understanding. The institutions that developed such thinking were not high schools. They gave these men a conception of how to govern because they gave them a vision of human life. And no more were they universities, since this is not what the university would soon consider its task to be. Notice what students emerging from these institutions are equipped with. The American founders did not go to universities. The college education they received before the day of electives was quite sufficient. Consider what these people were able to do. Consider how they could think. A single college, the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, produced 17 signers of the Declaration of Independence. Yes, they had to come from somewhere, but with what intelligence? In Canada, in the next century, the Fathers of Confederation still did not go to universities. They received the same kind of schooling. Of the 33 participants in the conferences that united this country, at least 14 attended the colleges I have named, or received what is called a solid classical education, or was educated at a séminaire, which taught the liberal arts curriculum as it had developed in France. As with the American founders, the education these men received equipped them with, to quote the recent editors of Canada's founding debates, the ability to move surely from practical questions to deliberations of a deeper character. What is the best form of government? What is the purpose of government? Liberty, prosperity, democracy? What gives a constitution legitimacy in the eyes of the people? What makes a nation great? They bring to the enterprise broad knowledge of political philosophy. They cite British, American, and French authorities. They illustrate their arguments with references to history, the great poets, and the Bible. Much of this command came from their education at these colleges. Augustine College has brought back the original Christian college model once dominant in North America. This sort of college ruled in North America. So here are two facts about Augustine College. We are this kind of college that I've been describing. We have its established purpose and thus the same curriculum. But you might not be convinced of a third thing I'm saying, that the objective in this liberal arts curriculum was to bring out in us the likeness of Christ. What I've been saying is that this model of college is the response to a biblical demand. All colleges. The demand is this: do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. What the Apostle Paul is saying here is that a renewal of the mind is needed. To renew something is to bring it back to its former glory, as in the conservation of a painting, stripping off the brown varnish, the accumulated grime, to get back to this point where the splendor of the original image can be seen again. The grime and filth are darkness in thinking, beliefs that keep you sitting in darkness. But as this transformation occurs, if you do your part in it, you acquire the power to test the way you think and discover what is good, Paul writes. Plain as day here, the Apostle Paul is saying that you do not know what is good and acceptable and perfect in the state you are now in. Can the soul be purified by changing how we think? The biblical answer is plainly yes. You can change how you think by instruction, by being taught. But a 21st century person looking back on the history of education doubts that what St. Paul is talking about was truly a concern of colleges. You might be thinking, maybe in the Middle Ages this was a real consideration. Then maybe the image of Christ might float above the enterprise. But not at these modern colleges, not in the age of science. But look at the mottos of these modern colleges. Veritas Christo et Ecclesiae, meaning truth for Christ and the church. Harvard, 1636. light and truth in both Latin and Hebrew. Yale, 1701. We know Harvard and Yale as universities, but they began as colleges, spreading the light of Christ for the church. We also know that at some point these schools renounced their Christian purpose, but don't project the present so far back as to think that purpose was never really there, that these mottos were just window dressing, an empty nod to the church. And let's continue. Dartmouth College, 1769, a voice of one crying in the wilderness, a phrase straight from the Bible, the motto of a college. People say this fit Dartmouth well when it started in the rough wilds of New Hampshire. But what was the idea? That as John the Baptist spread the word in the Judean desert, so Dartmouth would spread it in America, because it was the learning of the church that these schools were transmitting. Queen's College at Kingston, 1841, had the motto, in wisdom and doctrine, stability. St. Mary's College in South Bend, 1855, hail to the cross, our only hope. Ave Crux Spes was a prayer of the church in the 6th century. Toronto Baptist College, 1881, all things cohere in Christ. When in 1842, the founder of the college that became St. Mary's, later Notre Dame University, first arrived on the site on which his college would be built, he wrote, everything was frozen, and yet it all appeared so beautiful. The lake, particularly with its mantle of snow, resplendent in its whiteness, was to us a symbol of the stainless purity of our august lady, whose name the college bears, and also of the purity of soul which would characterize the new inhabitants of these beautiful shores. The point I'm making is that these Christian colleges were all founded with the Christian goal of education. Christianity has its own understanding of education to help the student to live. This was not a far-fetched idea for an 18th or 19th century college because it had been recognized for millennia, back to Augustine, to Socrates, to Moses, that the mind needs to be purified of its bad impulses. And teaching plays a central role in cleansing the mind. And when I say that the Christian college model from which all colleges came had this biblical purpose to form the image of Christ in people, take note of one thing. There's one item of information you ought not to miss. Who is running all these colleges? When the governors of a community vote to create a college, who carries this out and runs the thing? In every case, it is the church. Take these 25 colleges whose founding we have seen. How many of these colleges were founded by churches? That is to say, by the denominations that had also built churches in these various colonies, states, and provinces. There were Congregationalists or Puritans, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Baptists, Roman Catholics. Of the colleges in this list, which were created and run by these denominations? All of them. Education belonged to the churches. It was their area of concern. It is not that the churches were somehow better equipped to handle education for the state. Since medieval times, it had always been the business of the church to educate. Actually, all run by a denomination but one. Prince of Wales College in Charlottetown was officially non-denominational, not aligned with any one church. To be a non-denominational school was in fact a way of opening the doors to more students in places with too few Presbyterians, say, to fill a school. When the state of Maryland ceased to be officially Anglican, the minority churches in Annapolis, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and Catholics, founded the non-denominational St. John's College, whose charter stated that youth of all religious denominations shall be freely and liberally admitted. But the central fact is not changed by this. It has always been the business of the church to educate. And the Christian education that I've been describing could be offered as circumstances demanded by clergy and Christians who were not clergy of different denominations together, as we are doing at Augustine College. Look at the governors here at Upper Canada College. The education of youth was the business of the church, which reproduced a model of teaching driven by a biblical concern, renewal of the mind in the likeness of Christ. Now, to the extent that this story I have told you about the college is unfamiliar to you, notice you have acquired a different understanding of higher education, of the college, from somewhere else. Where did it come from? When higher education came to North America, virtually every denomination established a college wherever it could. There were no universities and no other colleges. But all the old Christian colleges established then are gone. They were all transformed into universities. I don't have time to tell the story of this phenomenon, but the churches whose job education had been simply let control go, and education was handed to whom? Experts in subject areas. The churches were fooled by this. Who were the experts on the knowledge of how to live, how to think about this world? I pause just to ask, what do churches and denominations today think? That they can rely on the university to teach the next generation? They must believe that a Christian needs no special learning as a Christian. That the church has let go of education is one of the most seismic events in the history of Christianity and of the West itself. Eventually, a rival idea of college would have to have come about for unbelievers who wanted it, but that is not what happened. No pluralism. The existing colleges gave up their blueprint, and no more colleges were built on the old plan. They're all gone, except for the few, very few places like this that recognize what has happened. I really have to close, but I appreciate that I cannot do that without answering the question you are asking. Why do you say our model of college has gone? There are plenty of Christian colleges. They are universities. They're not doing the same thing. It's not at all a bad thing they are doing. But it is a different project with a different end. The whole understanding of higher education has changed. Here are 5 changes. Run a school on these lines, and you are not doing what Christian education was created to do. Plenty of reason to do this new thing. But what about the old thing? Who's doing that? I'll be brief. First, free students from the old curriculum. The first way to change. In the 19th century, the governors of these Christian colleges started listening to complaints about the fixed liberal arts curriculum. All the colleges had enrolled every student in a single program of teaching. But people began to criticize colleges for, quote, confining their instructions to a strictly marked course? Don't people want to learn about more things? Don't they want options? In the medieval university, you studied what your college taught. But the 19th century university, on the German model, is a structure of different departments. You choose the subject you want to study. Second, add on practical courses. The Christian colleges decided that since they were the established purveyors of education, when society needed practical training in agriculture or business, they would provide it. When the university I studied at, one of them, was founded as Bytown College in 1848, its first prospectus said, "Besides Latin and other classical studies, bookkeeping will form an essential part of this course." If it is true that bookkeeping was an essential part of the Bytown College curriculum, this is a sign of a notable change in the focus of college education, because bookkeeping is a practical skill that is not going to address the way you think about life and govern yourself. It is not an art of the soul, as Christian education had always understood itself to be. Third, swap wisdom for knowledge. The colleges began thinking that as the central purveyors of education, their business was actually knowledge, not understanding. Or as Thorstein Veblen put it in 1918, the university is conceived as a business house dealing in merchantable knowledge. I hope you see the difference. Understanding is the knowledge of where you are and how to make your way, how to discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable, in the words of St. Paul. But knowledge is anything true in any area. Bytown College, which eventually became the University of Ottawa, had the motto, "God is the Lord of knowledge." Does that mean God is the Lord of bookkeeping too? I don't deny it. I can see the argument. But between God and bookkeeping, we do have a stretch from high to low. And the idea of lordship, which you have in this motto, is that the high commands your attention. But if your business is knowledge, that becomes the focus. One historian of this change to higher education notes that at these former colleges, required courses in moral philosophy, like the theology course before them, vanished from university curriculum. Vanished. The mottos of new universities, if you look at them, just talk about knowledge. Fourth, talk about the mind, not the soul. Education as the church understood it concerns the soul. It purifies the soul. It heals the soul. And we are suffering. Acquiring knowledge implies no such thing. Or maybe we should say the soul just gets a new identity. Let's skip the talk of illness, darkness. Be happy. At the new college, at the new university, you hear that all learning is good for you. Yet John of Salisbury said that learning is deadly if it replaces healing your soul. So any college singing this refrain is now in a very different band. On the website of one such college turned university, a Latin professor proudly writes, "I made sure my students learned our motto." Literally, this has been translated as studies determine character, but studia can mean anything which inspires your interest. Yes, it can today. The professor goes on to talk about how what he studied at this university inspired my interest and contributed to the kind of person I became. He's right, and John of Salisbury agreed. All studies form you, just as no studies form you. Everything forms you. But who do you become? Our understanding of education stems from our awareness of the importance of living, not becoming just anything, but bringing to light what we were made for. What has the view that any study is good, there is no urgent need, got to do with us? This takes us to the last difference I will mention. Fifth, to give up the Christian purpose of the college diverts students from reality. At a university, nothing is at stake. But at a college, everything was at stake. You were there to receive an accurate map of the world that would take you through this valley we are in, show you how to move here. Thomas Aquinas had said, the purpose of the study of philosophy is not to learn what others have thought, but to learn how the truth of things stands. Do you recall that college whose students, its founder hoped, would become pure as the snow? A student who went there in our time writes, I studied philosophy there, but a lot of the issues I struggled with in studying philosophy had to do with my very strong belief that from about Descartes on, all the philosophers just jumped off the deep end. I would constantly point out the discrepancies and gaping holes in their theories to my professor during class, and was always admonished to stop worrying about whether they were right or not, and just learn them for the test. At a university, it doesn't matter what you believe, whether what you are reading is true. At a university, nothing is at stake. This is not our understanding of the world. But where are our colleges? We have all been transported to Babylon, where we are now in exile from our own tradition. All the assumptions are different here, and since everyone in this room has been born in captivity, we are making those foreign assumptions. We believe these things. The strange thing about this exile, however, is that we agreed to it. The Israelites were forced out of Jerusalem. No one forced Christians to believe any of these things. Yet we do. The cost has been tremendous. The first place in which the Christian understanding has withered is in Christians, who are receiving no education beyond what is actually lower. The poor Christian student today is asked by his or her Christian community to take the Bible and what she has already learned and figure out all the rest for herself. This is not, as I have tried to show you, our way. Whose fault is it if the poor Christian student is saddled with all these confusions? And the others I have been pointing out. Are we not supposed to take care of the young, love them? But today, virtually every institution of higher learning is built off this line, under all those convictions that are foreign to us. But no one is forcing us to go along with them. The world that cares nothing for wisdom is not our world. We are free to walk out of Babylon and go home to our own culture, simply by living as we used to do. If you are a student, get understanding. If you are a parent, direct your child to a thing of value. Stop buckling under his claims about what interests him. Remind him that it interests him to live. If you are part of a church, edge your church back to the role it always had, involvement in schools that renewed the minds of the young. If you are a John de Balliol with money to leave some for the growth of the movement to reclaim education, to return to Christians a Christian higher education. It will not be a movement without you. If you are a Walter de Merton with money to give, understand that you are trading paper for life. Pray that we would turn back to wisdom and be the church we used to be. I thank you for your kind patience.